Here are your objectives for today. Take a moment, please, and write those down. We are starting a new unit, of course, since you took the exam on Friday of last week. We are beginning Unit 2, and with the revolution over, we are now going to look at what sometimes historians call a critical period in our nation's history, the very early years of our nation's history. And I have two objectives there on the screen up there. I want to talk to you about our first national government and the strengths and weaknesses of our first national government, which were under a document called the Articles of Confederation. Then the second part of my large group is to talk to you about how eventually that is going to be replaced with the U.S. Constitution. And in forming and creating that U.S. Constitution, there are a whole bunch of compromises that had to occur amongst the people gathered there in Philadelphia. And so the second part of my large group is to talk to you about those various compromises that had to occur during that convention. So those are my two objectives today. And you should have two sides to your handout, and it should go right in order for you. The first part of my large group is just to explain this first national government to you. And this first national government doesn't last very long. As you can see, it's only in existence for about 8 years. And once we defeat the British and we become independent, this is the framework. So our first original national government is a document called the Articles of Confederation. That is our first original national government. Now there's some good things and bad things about this first national government, and that's what we're going to take a look at here. Remember, every state, of which used to be colonies, the 13 colonies now are 13 states, they have their own state governments, but now there's going to be this confederation, this alliance of the 13 states into what becomes known as the Articles of Confederation government. Here's a little video that's going to take us through this short little time period and introduce us to this framework of our first national government.
It's 1781. The states are all fighting. No one has the power to get anything done. The Articles of Confederation turn out to be a blueprint for political disaster. So, what exactly were the Articles? Many of us vaguely remember them as America's original Constitution, the flawed prototype for our federal government, right?
No one thought of them as a constitution. The states had constitutions because the states were the sovereign entities.
The Articles were explicitly designed to have a weak central government and very strong state governments.
Under the Articles, the 13 original states aren't states as we know them today, but more like independent sovereign nations. There aren't 3 branches of government like we have today either. What little power there is wielded by the one and only branch, the Congress.
The revolutionaries wanted to keep the Congress very limited in power for fear that it could become another British Parliament, and whatever power the states would give to it, it might turn that power against them. So they made sure that the real power of government remained on the state level.
Instead of passing laws that the 13 states must obey, the most Congress can do is ask pretty please. The biggest disaster in this flawed system is the economy. 13 different paper currencies flood the country, fueling runaway inflation. Unregulated tariffs push prices sky high. And the central government is always broke, since it has no power to levy taxes.
And so at every level, from Congress to the states, to the towns, to the individuals, people are strapped. And this is one of the reasons why that a new way of thinking about the form of government, the authority of government, and the way in which revenue should be raised becomes central to the questioning and the revisioning of the Articles of Confederation.
But for those Americans desperate for food and jobs, a debate about fixing the government isn't enough. They want to take the whole thing down. In 1786, a former captain in the Revolutionary Army, Daniel Shays, leads a mass revolt against the government and attacks the Federal Armory in Massachusetts. It takes the battle-scarred Massachusetts militia to finally put down the rebellion. But a new wave of uprisings seems like a sure thing, unless Americans can come together and agree on how to run the country.
So the first
All right, so understand this really quick, that this Articles of Confederation framework purposefully creates strong state governments. Most of political power rests at the state level. No more kings, no more monarchies that you see up there. You've got your royal hat crossed off. But those patriots that have just underwent a victory against the British don't want to create a strong national government. They just rebelled and threw off power from the British Empire. They want a type of system in which most powers rest with the state and local governments. So they create a national framework under these articles in which most powers are at the state level and very few powers at the national level. The national government is purposely made to be weak. Okay? So please understand that. And this idea behind it is they want power to rest with the people. That's this idea of popular sovereignty that you see up there. And they thought that that best can be handled when power is located at a local level like a state government and not at some national level. They thought that is where governments can be best held to the people and people ultimately in control. Now that's going to have some problems because there are these state constitutions, and in each state, that's where power rests. But what you need to understand is there's some weaknesses that you need to be aware of. And then there's some achievements. So let me actually go to the weaknesses first, then I'm going to come back to the achievements. You heard it in the video, but I'm going to re-emphasize it. One of the first and prominent economic problems is that this Articles of Confederation does not give the national government the power to tax. There's no power given to this Articles of Confederation national government to get money through taxation. And that's a big issue because there's a war that has been won that we owe a lot of money. We had a lot of debt as a country now, a new nation, and there's no revenue source through taxation to then pay off this debt. That's a problem. How are you going to pay off the war debts if this new national government doesn't have the power to tax? State governments could. State governments could tax, but not the national government. And that was on purpose. Another weakness. On purpose, this new national government under the Articles was not given the power to really regulate trade. Now the fancy word up there is commerce. But you might want to just write down in your notes that commerce means trade. And so if the national government really doesn't have the power to regulate trade, that can cause all kinds of problems. State governments were doing that. So can you imagine having 13 different arrangements dealing with trade from foreign countries, depending on where that foreign good was coming into the country at, maybe in Charlestown, South Carolina, maybe at the port in Boston, Massachusetts, and every one of those state governments is regulating trade in a different way? That's not really a united country at all. And so therefore, that's a problem. And in fact, in some cases, states are going to start taxing each other on the goods that are coming through each other's state borders. And that's not good because that's basically discouraging trade going from one state to another if they're taxing each other and so on. So that's another weakness that you need to be aware of. And all this is designed on purpose, going back to that idea of keeping most power in the states. Third one, it was almost impossible to amend the Articles. So let's just say that they said, well, this is a problem. We need to actually fix the Articles, amend them. There's only one way to do it, and that is to get all 13 states to agree. Unanimous vote of all 13 states to agree to amend the Articles. That's extremely hard. to get all 13 states to unanimously agree. So the process by which to amend the articles, to fix them, to add something to them, was very, very difficult. And that's a weakness. Fourth one, and you heard it in the video, the Articles of Confederation only created one branch, and that was a legislative branch called Congress, where every state received one vote. There was no executive branch, no branch to go out and enforce the laws that Congress does pass. So therefore, who's going to enforce the laws that this national government creates? Nobody. It was up to the states to enforce them. So again, that's a weakness. That's going to make this national government not very strong when there's no real enforcement mechanism or an enforcement branch. Like today we have the president and the strong executive branch. That didn't exist under this first national government. So that's a weakness. Number 5, something else that's going to come up pretty quickly. There's no national court system. Now, every state has a constitution and every state has its own state court system, but there's no national court system. So how if one state sues another state? Where does that court case go? Well, there was no place for it to go. There was no national court system. Remember, the Articles of Confederation only created a one-branch government, and that was a legislative body called Congress. So there wasn't a court system to deal with state issues amongst themselves, and no final national judicial authority. That's a weakness. You saw that in the video. Every state had the power to make its own money. So you had 13 different currencies going on, depending on where you live. There was a Virginia currency, there was a Massachusetts currency, there was a Pennsylvania currency. There was no national currency because the national government did not have the power to quote-unquote coin money. That's a weakness. That's going to make trade very difficult when you're constantly having to exchange different currencies depending on where you're located. Doesn't really encourage trade and buying and selling amongst the different states. So I've already identified 6 weaknesses that are going to quickly start to emerge in our early nation's history. I've already mentioned this, but I'll emphasize it again. There is no executive branch. There's just a Congress. Nothing like what we currently have today when we have a president representing a strong executive branch. Didn't exist. So that's another weakness. And there's no national military. You have to remember that when the revolution was fought, it was all these state militias that was really organized, and there was a continental army, but there was really no ability to have a national military under the Articles. A standing army. What I mean by that, a standing army, is one that's permanent. A permanent standing army. Once the war was over, the army was dismissed. There was no permanent military power like we have today, where there's constantly an army, a navy, a marines that's on a permanent status. That was not the case under the Articles. So here you have now 9 weaknesses that over the first few years that I gave you, like 1781 to 1789, made this country, as a United States of 13 states, pretty weak because most power remained in the states. Now I say that, but the rest of your handout on the front side also acknowledges a couple of successes. So hopefully there's room there under the subheading where you can acknowledge that there are some successes. And here I'm going to give them to you. There's 2. One, we have to give this one credit. This Articles of Confederation government was able to successfully defeat the British in the American Revolutionary War and get a treaty with the British. It's called the Treaty of Paris, 1783, formally ending the American Revolution, granting this new country independence. And so you've got to give that government credit. It was able to get the country through a war successfully negotiate a treaty with the most powerful nation in the world, grant us independence, get us land all the way to the Mississippi River. Some of your maps from last unit had a boundary at the Appalachian Mountains. Now all of a sudden this new treaty gets us all the land up to the Mississippi River. And if you know your geography, that's a whole bunch more land. So there is something to be said about it. It did accomplish a few good things. The second one on the right is the second thing I want you to write down, because we have to give this new government that was very weak a little bit of credit. And it's right here, if you see the space darkened in black on the map. I told you that this new country now has a new border, and that's the Mississippi River. There was a big discussion after the war. Whose land should it be? This new land that now Britain has given this new country, whose land should it be? Who should be in control of it? Some of the states thought it should be their land, like Virginia saying, well, we're the oldest colony, now we're a state, we should claim all that land. But one thing that comes out of this Articles of Confederation government is that this Congress, this one-body Congress, was able to get the states to give up their old claims and to agree to hand that over to the National Congress and have the National Congress deal with this land. It's something called the Northwest Ordinances. And if you write that down, I want you to understand that basically what the Northwest Ordinances did was it took this piece of land that's shaded in black, and it basically divided it up into squares. Surveying the land is one of the reasons why if you ever fly in an airplane, fly east, and you have a window seat and you look down, you will notice that if you look down, you see a whole bunch of squares. Partially because that land was surveyed, broken up into squares and acres, and then put up for sale. And so when you look down there, now you see the ramifications of that land being surveyed, broken up into squares, and then sold. And then, of course, if people are going to buy that land and settle there, how if that population gets pretty high and they want to become a state? So one of these Northwest Ordinances was to just talk about adding new states to the Union once a certain population threshold has been met. So you have to give this new national government, with all of its weaknesses, a couple of things of credit. It got us through the war, and it got us through this first main problem of what are you going to do with this new land that you just now have because of the Treaty of Paris granting you land all the way to the Mississippi River. It was able to organize it, start kind of coming up with ideas of settling it, and eventually adding more states in the future. Okay? Now, I would argue those two successes don't outweigh all the 9 weaknesses that I just talked to you about, but it is the story of this young nation with a few successes and some major, major problems. Now, towards the bottom of your handout, you hopefully have space for at least one more thing, and that is something called Shays' Rebellion. Hopefully there's a little space for it down there for you. And you caught a little bit of it in the video that you were shown here at the very beginning of large group. Shays' Rebellion takes place in Massachusetts. And as the video showed you, a whole bunch of Massachusetts farmers are not very happy with the Massachusetts state government. The Massachusetts state government after the war has a big debt. The Massachusetts state government starts to collect taxes, and in those days, the main tax that the state government relied on was property taxes. Well, who do you think owns a lot of property? Farmers. They own a lot of land. And so those property taxes are going to negatively affect a lot of farmers. And so all these farmers that are going to be looking at Shays as their leader are going to start a rebellion against the state government. Now, why is that significant for you to understand? That's going to scare the bejeebies out of a lot of Americans who see this as a mob rule uprising. And we can't let mob rule dictate who's in charge of the government. And so people with money, people who want stability, are very afraid of events like this one, Shays' Rebellion. All right? Now, it's true that the Massachusetts militia puts down the rebellion, but it doesn't change the fear that is emerging in more and more Americans' eyes. People like Alexander Hamilton, you heard the song from the musical. Hamilton's like, we got to do something about this potential uprising like Shays, because the national government's not strong enough to put rebellions like this down. And so that scares more and more Americans. Enough to where they decide to meet and talk about fixing the problems. This is where we go with the second half. Now, if you turn over, hopefully now there's the second half of the large group. Because they decide to meet at Philadelphia. And at Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, delegates from all 13 states are going to gather there. I'm going to skip the movie. Oh, there we go. Oh, that's a nice little sound transition there. So they decide to meet in Philadelphia. All the states send delegates. They've recently just experienced Shays' Rebellion. These people there are scared of the events, something like that. And so they're there. And you can see here, George Washington's there. A lot of our founding fathers that you might recognize their names are there. Hamilton, Adams, James Madison. A lot of those founding fathers you've probably heard of. They're there because they think, look, these 9 weaknesses and maybe even more weaknesses need to be fixed. And what they first conclude is they can't be fixed, so they scrap them. They basically take the old articles, rip them up, throw them away. That's why I don't play basketball. And they said, let's start brand new. And they start writing what you and I today call the Constitution. So at Philadelphia, at this convention, 55 delegates show up representing all the different states, and they're like, heck with revising the articles and trying to fix these problems. Let's just start from scratch. Now, if we start from scratch, what are we going to start off with? Well, Virginia has a plan. It's called the Virginia Plan. And Virginia, you need to know this, has a lot of people living in it. It's what you might call a large populated state. And here's what their conclusion is. One of the reasons that the Articles of Confederation was weak is because larger populated states weren't being treated fairly. Under the old Articles of Confederation Congress, every state got only one vote. Whether you were a large populated state or a small populated state, every state only received one vote. And they didn't think that was fair. They thought representation should be based on population. And the larger your state is populated, the more votes you should get in Congress. So the Virginia plan was, let's create a Congress, but let's create a Congress that's based on population. The larger populated states should get more votes than the smaller populated states. It's what's called the Large State Plan, and again, it was biased towards larger populated states, getting more representatives. Well, how do you think that's going to go over with the smaller populated states? Hopefully you would agree, not very well. And New Jersey, they send their delegates to Philadelphia. They said, no. We don't like this idea that larger populated states should get more votes in Congress, in our legislative body. We should stay with this idea that every state is equal amongst the 13 of us. No one state is more important. So we like this idea of equal representation. So New Jersey says, we're not going to vote for Virginia's plan. We're only wanting this idea that Congress should remain equally represented per state, no matter the population. So now you've got a small state plan and a large state plan. And you've got a big argument here. In fact, some of the delegates are threatening to go home and not even finish this task because they couldn't get over this big hump as to how is representation going to work in this new national government since we're starting from scratch. And it's not until somebody comes up with a compromise. In fact, it's such an important compromise, it's called the Great Compromise because of its importance. Basically, it's this, ladies and gentlemen. The Great Compromise says, okay, some of you want large populated states to be having more representation. Some of you want this idea of every state being equal. Why don't we just do this? Let's create 2 houses in our Congress. So rather than just having a 1-house Congress, let's have a 2-house Congress. One will be based on population. That'll be called the House of Representatives. It'll be based on population, which means the larger populated states will have more votes because they'll be able to send more people and vote, each getting a vote because of the population of their state. And then we'll create this other body called the U.S. Senate, but it'll be based on this idea of equal representation. So every state will send 2 senators, no matter their population. That means everybody's treated equally, everybody being the states. So now, all of you should be feeling pretty good because you each get what you want. There'll be 2 houses. Before a law can be passed, it has to go through anybody? It has to go through both of them. And that way, both sides feel like they have their representation intact. That becomes the great compromise, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to need to know that for the test. I guarantee you, in a few weeks when we have another unit test, there'll be a question about this great compromise and how it tried to solve the problem of the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. But another problem comes up. Because just as soon as you solve this problem, you've got another problem that comes up. And that is, you have this House representative body that's based on population. Well, just exactly what do you mean by population? Because, yeah, you have a bicameral legislature. Oh, by the way, bicameral, just like when you ride a bicycle, 2 wheels, bicameral just means 2 houses. Bicameral, 2 houses, like bicycle means 2 wheels. So yes, we've now got a system here by which you have a House representatives. Currently there's 435 of them because it's based on population. We have a U.S. Senate, 2 per state, 50 states, 100, every state getting treated equally. But the quick question that came up very soon was, well, wait a second. If we're going to count population, who do you count? And that's where you get this compromise. It's called the 3/5 compromise. Now, if there's something that students and adults misunderstand, it's this. Okay? They get this confused. The 3/5 compromise was this. Should we count slaves when a state is counting its population? Now, who do you think says yes? Who do you think says, yes, that's a good idea, we should count our slaves? Come on now, folks, you just took a test last week. What region of the country do you think is saying, yes, we should count our slaves? Yes, the southern states are saying, by all means, we should count our population and our slave population. That makes sense. Who do you think says, no, that really shouldn't be the way it is because we don't think that's right? Northern states. Very good. So you've got a problem here again because you've just agreed that there's going to be this body called the House and it's going to be based on population, but now who are you going to count? And some of your northern states are saying, well, you shouldn't be able to count all your slaves. And the southern states are saying, well, yeah, we should. And so in order to get past this problem, there's another compromise, and it's called the 3/5 compromise. And here's what it basically does. It says, all right, states, we're going to count your slave population, but not all of them, only 60% of them. 3/5 is a fraction for basically 60%. So for purposes of population and representation in the House, we'll count 60% of your slaves. Does that mean southern states are going to get more people in the House of Representatives from those areas? Yes. But do they get 100% of their slave population? No. Now, this is a compromise. This is just a way to keep the northern and southern states together, just like the Great Compromise was trying to keep the larger populated states and smaller populated states together. The whole goal is we got to come up with a new document. Remember that one that I tried to hit in the trash can and I missed? Okay? This new proposal has to be something that we all agree on, and if we can't agree on some of these things, we're not going to have a new document. So some historians call this document a bundle of compromises, and it truly is that. Think about the compromise, the Great Compromise, over how many houses and what that should be based on. And now the subsequent question of, should we count slaves or not? Those are a whole bunch of different compromises, a whole bunch of different issues that are being brought up. Now, and there are other compromises. There's a compromise as to how our president should be chosen. And just in case you don't know this from grade school and middle school, we use the Electoral College as a way to elect our president rather than just the popular vote. And sometimes that leads to controversy over our history. But that's what the founding fathers in Philadelphia wanted because some people didn't trust the popular vote to select a president. So there are other compromises, but I wanted to highlight these two, at least for now, as to show you why the Constitution was not just something that everybody agreed to right away and everybody was all happy. No, there was a whole bunch of give and take in this Philadelphia Convention for the weeks and weeks that they met to try to carve out a new framework for our national government. So again, please understand, we are not talking about slaves voting, are we? No. We're talking about 60% of the slave population being counted for purposes of how many seats a state like Virginia gets in the House of Representatives. That's all we're counting. Slaves have no rights. Slaves are not voting. That's not the issue here. It's how much of their population, slave population, should a state be able to count for purposes of how many representatives they get to send to the House of Representatives. Okay? 3/5 compromise. Here's a famous quote. You do not have to write it all down, but as you can see, it's a quote that is given credit to James Madison. He is the guy who is credited for writing most of the Constitution. This document that we're talking about today, the author of it, a lot of historians would say, is up to this guy. This guy was able to get and pretty much write the framework of our Constitution. Had to give and take with the particular compromises, but this guy authored most of the document and credited for being the author of the Constitution. But there's an issue. How much power are we going to give this national government? Remember, the whole issue of the Articles, they did not want to give a lot of power to the national government, wanted most to stay with the states. How do you get power to be divided? Well, we call that a concept called federalism. Federalism, okay? Dividing power. Some powers going with the national government, some powers resting with the states, some powers only be given to certain branches of the national government. Because you need to know this, that the Constitution actually takes power and separates it into 3 branches. And some of you know this already from grade school and middle school. You've got an Article 1, they create a Congress, a legislative branch. We now know it's a bicameral legislature, 2 houses. They're there to make the laws. Make the laws. What are the laws going to be? That's the legislative branch's job. And it's going to take going through both houses in order for a law to be passed. Okay? Then you've got the executive branch. To try to make up for the mistake of the Articles, we're going to create a branch that's just there to enforce the laws that Congress makes. So that's what the president and all the executive branch is there to do. Take the laws that Congress passes and enforces them. And now, with the ability to enforce them, you now have a stronger national government. So Article 2 of the Constitution explains what the national branch is and how they're supposed to enforce the laws passed by this national legislature. And then remember that third weakness that I talked about, or one of the other weakness was, there was no judicial branch, so the Constitution creates a judicial branch. Today we call it the Supreme Court. So Congress, made up of the 2 houses, legislative branch, Article 1. President, executive branch, Article 3, Supreme Court, judicial branch. What is it supposed to do? Interpret the laws. Interpret the meaning of the laws. Heck, even interpret the Constitution, we're going to find out. What does that Constitution mean? It's this branch that decides what that means. Now you've got 3 distinct branches, each given certain powers. That's something I want you to understand. That's called separation of powers. It's part of this whole dividing power and making sure power doesn't go in just one place. That's something that scares the bejeebies out of these young American citizens. Power being in just one place that could abuse and be abuse of power, the fear was. So today you get what you see this, I hope. You maybe have been introduced to this. You've got the 3 branches, and I've just given them to you. Okay? You got your legislative branch. All right? They're writing the laws. They're ratifying treaties. They're declaring war. And you've got the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, where they interpret the laws. They interpret the Constitution. And then, of course, you've got the executive branch who's proposing laws. They can say, I've got a good idea for a law. And they can eventually have other powers like administer the laws and enforce them. And they are the commander-in-chief when there is a war. But these are 3 distinct branches, each with their own powers. We call that checks and balances. We might get into that in the small group a little bit more. But there you have it. You got your 2 houses of Congress, you've got your Supreme Court, and you get your President of the United States representing the executive branch. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as I'm trying to bring some closure here, This proposed document is just that, a proposal. The Constitution says before this can become the new framework of our government, it has to go and get 9 states to ratify it. 9 of the 13 states have to give it a thumbs up. And there are going to be 2 different distinct groups that are going to form. The Federalists, they want the Constitution, folks. They're all in favor of this new document, this new framework. They're called the Federalists. They want the Constitution. They're in favor of having this new national government framework. They tend to come from a wealthier group, as you see over here on the left side. They're made up of people like Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, some of the founding fathers that you're very familiar with their names. And they want a strong national government like this document creates. But then you've got the blue side, the side that thinks this is a scary thing. They become known as the Anti-Federalists. They don't want this Constitution. They fear how much power is now being granted to the national government. They would rather have most of the power stay where? In the states. They tend to be wanting more state government power. They tend to be coming more from middle classes and lower classes. And they tend to be represented by people like Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and so on. Last thing, make sure you write this in your notes. 9 states have to ratify this document before it can become the supreme law of the land. Ladies and gentlemen, make sure you upload your notes back in front to where your small group teacher wants you to. Have a good rest of your day. Yes.